Hey guys, Jason here. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to dial in a metal tone using just about any plugin. Alright guys, I'm going to break this up into 4 parts for you. Consider this like the virtual table of contents for this video. Part 1, I'm going to share with you which plugins I'm using, and I'm actually using 3 different plugins. I'll tell you why later. Part 2, you're going to hear what each one of these plugins sounds like by itself. Part 3, you're going to hear what each plugin sounds like in the full mix. Yes, with bass, drums, 2 guitar tracks, and maybe unicorns. I don't know where that came from. Part 4, I'm gonna share with you my exact settings that I want you to use, because this is gonna be how you can get an awesome metal tone using just about any plugin. So hang around for that part. All right guys, let's dive right into the 3 plugins I'm using. Now, all 3 of these are very common virtual amp simulators that I'm using here. And the first one is Positive Grid's Bias Amp 2. And I'm using their Triple Treadplate amp, and I'm pairing that with the Bias Amp 2 Celestion speaker package. The second amp sim I'm using is Amplitube's Mesa Triple Rectifier amp sim. Now, this is their version 3, I think. I know they have a version 4, maybe even a version 5, I don't know. But I bought this plugin a long time ago, so I figured I'd throw this in with the mix because Amplitube is pretty popular as well. Lastly, I'm using a mix of a free amp simulator. You guys know Legion by LePou. I hope I pronounced your name right, dude, and I'm so sorry if I didn't. LePou. So his Legion amp, that's a free amp sim, and I'm pairing that with the Torpedo Wall of Sound, and I'm using their Mesa cabinet. All right, so are you ready to hear what each one of these amp sims sounds like? Here they are, and I'll post a picture of the amp sim I'm using so you know which one it is. Alright, I think this is part 3, and this is where you get to hear what each amp simulator sounds like in the full mix, with bass, drums, dual guitars, and I think I said there's unicorns in here as well. Actually, I don't think I have unicorns in here, but I know they exist. Alright guys, now for part 4, and this is the exciting part for you because I'm about to share the exact settings that I use for every one of these amp sims. Now, here's the kicker, and this is part of the title of this video, how you can dial in a good metal tone using any plugin. I'm going to give you the settings that you can use, and I suggest that you start out with on any plugin that you're using. Now, assuming it's a metal amp sim, right? We're playing metal music here, so you don't want to like use a blues amp simulator for metal because it's not going to sound right. Actually, that might be a cool subgenre. Who knows? But anyway, I'm going to share the settings, and again, this setting I'm going to show you, I used it on every amp sim that you just heard. So let's pull up the Positive Grid Bias Amp 2 EQ and amp settings here. Here it is. As you can see, the bass is at like right up and down, like at 5 there. I cut my mids back just a hair, usually between 3.5 and 4. That's just how I prefer my sounds. My treble is usually around 7, sometimes between 6 and 7. My presence, I don't like a whole lot of presence, and this sometimes will depend on the amp, but typically for metal, I'll cut that back to about 4. Now, the gain for my rhythm tones, I don't use an oversaturated sound here. I don't turn the gain all the way up. I actually leave the gain at about, between 6 and 7. I might even cut it down, less than that, depending on what the song calls for. And the reason I do that is because if you oversaturate it, it might sound good in your bedroom, but when you put that into the mix, it's gonna make things very muddy. Take your shoes off before entering. And then my master volume is usually just up the middle at like 5. Now let's move over to what I'm using for the boost. I typically put like a Ibanez Tube Screamer simulator, and in this case, Positive Grid, they have their own simulator here. I'll put that in there, and this is typical with any like real metal tube amp, like an Engel or Mesa or PV6505, whatever you happen to be using. But I'll throw that in front of the amp. My tone's usually up and down, give or take. My gain level is like all the way down, and the actual level itself, I'll put it around 6 or 7. I know some people like to turn that all the way up, but I don't like the sound that gives. I like it when I cut it back just a little bit to 6 or 7. That's just my opinion, and it's what sounds good to me. All right, now let's take a look at the settings I'm using for the Amplitube amp, which again, these are going to be the exact same settings that you just saw on Positive Grid's Bias Amp 2. It's just a different plugin that we're using here. Same settings. So you can see, this is the based on the Triple Rectifier, I believe, from Mesa Boogie. I'm using channel 3 on this amp sim. You can see my bass is up and down. Again, I cut my mids back a little bit to about 4-ish. My trebles, between 6 and 7, usually towards the 7 mark there. Cut my presence back to about 4. A good rule of thumb is my mids and my presence are sometimes about the same. I'm not saying they should be. It's just that's how I kind of remember to do them both the same way. Master volume straight up and down. My gain is, usually between 6 and 7, and I've got a booster in front of this amp as well with the same settings. It's just Amplitude's version of their Tube Screamer. Now, I also want to share with you, lastly, the Legion amp settings. Now, I personally think this amp, for a free amp sim, is just awesome, and I know a lot of you have played with this amp sim several times because it's been around for many, many years. But here's my settings here, and as you can see, again, they're the same. Bass is straight up and down. My mids are cut back to about 4. The treble's at about 7. My presence, I cut that back to, usually 3.5, 4-ish, something like that. My gain's not all the way up. It's at around 6, 7-ish. And actually on this particular amp, the Legion amp, I actually cut my gain back a little bit more because this amp has a lot of saturation to it. Now for this particular amp, I don't use a booster in front of it, and you can kind of get away with it on the Legion amp. So you kind of have to play around with this part of it, depending on the amp. This amp, again, has a lot of saturation to it, but it's a very clean saturation, if that makes sense. A lot of times you put that booster in front of the amp to tighten up the tone a bit, and that does wonders if you're using a high gain amp, but you kind of get like a muddier sound that's kind of breaking up there. So you throw that booster in front of it just to kind of clean it up and tighten it up a little bit so you can hear those notes that you're playing, and every note's distinguished. So guys, that's it. That is how you can get a good metal tone using just about any plugin. You don't have to overcomplicate things. Now, of course, there are the cabinet settings, and I didn't really go into those, but I'll just tell you real quick. On cabs, I try to use a cabinet, a virtual cabinet, obviously. I try to use one that has the Celestion speakers in it, or if I'm using a Mesa amp, I'll pair it with the Mesa cabinet, the Mesa virtual cabinet, so to speak. And I typically will only use the Shure SM57 virtual mic sim with these amps. I know there's a lot of other mics, but guys, I just like to keep things simple. That's just my nature. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to get a good metal tone. It's just what I do, and I've had a lot of questions again on Jason, like, dude, how do you get such cool metal tones in almost every one of your videos? And you guys know I've used plugins actually on some of my albums as well. And most people just really can't tell the difference if that's a real tube amp I recorded or if it's a plugin. Now, one point I want to make with what I just said there, and I think this is a very crucial point. There are some people out there, it's like, well, I'm just going to record using tube amp only. Well, here's the kicker to that. You might record that track using a tube amp, miking an amp, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do this, but you might very well want to do that and call that organic. But once you put it into the studio and you start adding EQs and compression and all this other stuff, and then you do the final mastering, look, that tone has gone through some processing. So I'm not opposed to using plugins, or to you guys want to use anybody. I'm not opposed to anyone using, something that's not a mic tube amp. Now, I would love to just mic up a tube amp for every one of my albums, even for every one of my videos, but it's just not possible to do that all the time. If you got neighbors, or if you just don't have the space or the room dimensions or the soundproofing, all that good stuff that you need to really get a good tone from a tube amp. I know that's not feasible for most people. It's not feasible for me either. So a lot of times I will use plugins. But again, don't let anyone tell you that, well, you're just going the easy way out by using plugins. No, because again, once you mic a tube amp and record it, it still goes through processing after that. So we can't really call it organic, right? And two, even using a virtual amp sim, and I'm kind of getting off track here, but kind of going in one of my little rabbit trails, so to speak. But when you're recording using a plugin, you're still playing your instrument, which is a lot more than what pretty much every other genre of music out there is doing. We're still playing our guitar, right? So the talent is still there. So don't let anyone tell you or give you crap about using plugins versus using a real amp, okay? Because there's other factors involved there. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget, you can download a free song from me. Go to the link in the YouTube description there. I've got a link you can go to. It's going to ask for your email address. Put that in. That's my way of keeping in touch with you. And I'll send you a free instrumental metal track, a very cool track that is. So get your free metal song there. And until the next video, as always, keep it metal. Hey, I did 2 metal signs today. 2 is better than 1.